Imagine this. An ordinary day at a local grocery store turns into a scene straight out of a nightmare. A sweet, elderly woman, a grandmother with kind eyes and a calm smile, is suddenly handcuffed in the middle of the aisle. Shoppers freeze. Phones are out. Whispers ripple through the crowd. What could she possibly have done to deserve this? Officer Davis, a young cop, trained to respond without hesitation, believes he's doing the right thing. A misunderstanding, or is it more than that? Tension hangs in the air like a storm waiting to break. The grocery items, the innocent tote bag, all seem ordinary. Yet here she is, accused of something shocking. But then, she leans and whispers just a few words. Words so soft, so quiet, that only Officer Davis hears them. And in that moment, everything changes. His hands freeze over the handcuffs. His heart pounds. What she says makes him go pale. Because those words carry not just truth, but decades of wisdom, integrity, and a life lived with honor. The store goes silent. The shoppers can feel it. Something monumental is happening. They don't yet understand, but the energy shifts. Officer Davis begins to question himself. Could he have almost made a grave mistake? Could one quiet grandmother reveal a truth so powerful it shakes even the most confident authority figure to his core? As the security footage is reviewed, the reality hits like a thunderbolt. She did nothing wrong. Every item in her tote, every gesture, every smile captured on camera tells a story of honesty, kindness, and decades of living right. And the more Officer Davis sees, the more he realizes this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a life lesson, delivered in a single whisper. The tension, the guilt, the relief, it's all here. And the moment is about to escalate even further. Because what she whispers next doesn't just clear her name. It challenges everything he thought he knew about authority, assumptions, and the power of human dignity. Stay with us. Watch closely, because this story isn't just about a misunderstanding in a store. It's about respect, patience, humility, and the quiet strength of truth. By the end, you'll see why a single grandmother's whisper could teach an entire room a lesson they'll never forget. Welcome to Midnight Stories, the channel where every story hides a secret and every secret has a lesson. From shocking real-life events to moments that will make your heart race, we bring the most mysterious, emotional, and unforgettable stories straight to you. Turn off the lights, stay close, and step into a world where truth is stranger and more powerful than fiction. It all began with a sound that no one in the store could ignore, a sharp clink of metal that seemed to echo louder than it should. The entire grocery store went silent for a heartbeat. Customers froze mid-step, staring at the center of the aisle as a uniformed police officer handcuffed an elderly woman. Not just any woman, a small, frail black grandmother with silver hair and soft, wrinkled hands. Her face carried the calm dignity of someone who had weathered storms her entire life. Yet the fear in the eyes of the onlookers made the moment feel surreal. "Ma'am, you're under arrest," Officer Davis said, his voice steady and authoritative. The words sounded almost mechanical, as if he were reading from a script. But the gravity of the situation couldn't be overstated. People started pulling out their phones, recording every moment. Whispers rippled through the aisles like a wave. Why is he arresting her? She's a grandmother. Did she even do anything? Evelyn, the woman now in handcuffs, didn't resist. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She merely looked up at the officer with calm, unwavering eyes. There was a quiet strength in her gaze that made some shoppers instinctively step back. It was clear she was not the kind of person to be intimidated easily. Yet, the tension in her small frame betrayed just a hint of worry. Not for herself, but for the embarrassment and injustice happening in front of dozens of witnesses. The scene was chaotic in its stillness. A young mother froze while gripping her child's hand. An elderly man leaned against a shopping cart, mouth agape, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. A teenager filming the incident whispered to his friend, "This can't be real. They're arresting a grandma in the middle of the store?" Officer Davis, a young cop who had only been on the force for a few years, tried to maintain control. He had been trained to act quickly in situations that seemed suspicious, but nothing in his training prepared him for the mix of fear, confusion, and disbelief radiating from the crowd. He was doing what he believed was his duty, but already The weight of hundreds of eyes scrutinizing his every move was pressing down on him like an invisible hand. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. She had spent decades navigating life with grace, dignity, and independence. This trembling was the involuntary response of someone who had been caught in a situation they never expected. Someone whose life had always been about fairness and honesty suddenly being questioned. She looked around the store, and for a moment, her eyes met those of a young cashier who looked equally shocked. The cashier shook her head, clearly realizing that this was a misunderstanding, but too intimidated to speak up. The officer walked her toward the front of the store, keeping one hand on her elbow. Every step seemed to echo in the silence of the grocery store. Shelves stocked with colorful boxes and canned goods seemed irrelevant now, overshadowed by the tension in the air. Some shoppers whispered fervently among themselves, debating whether to call the manager or take action. Others simply recorded silently, not wanting to interfere, but unable to look away. Evelyn's calm composure contrasted sharply with the mechanical, procedural tone of Officer Davis. He read her rights, the words flowing quickly, almost rehearsed. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As he spoke, Evelyn's eyes never left his. There was no fear there, only a quiet but commanding presence, a sense that she had endured far greater challenges in her life than being accused of theft. People began whispering about her age, her appearance, and the sheer audacity of what was happening. She looks like she's in her 70s, one shopper muttered. This is insane. He can't really be arresting her. Some stepped closer, trying to understand the situation, while others backed away, unsure if they were witnessing a crime or a monumental injustice. The store manager finally arrived, slightly out of breath, clutching a clipboard and trying to assert authority. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding, he said. But Officer Davis, confident in his immediate assessment, gestured for the manager to step back. Evelyn, hearing the manager's words, didn't panic or argue. She simply exhaled, a small, controlled breath that seemed to carry years of patience and experience. She knew that arguing in the heat of the moment would do nothing to de-escalate the situation. Then, something remarkable happened. Instead of pleading, crying, or yelling, Evelyn looked directly at Officer Davis, her gaze steady, and whispered something so quietly that only he could hear. There was an authority in that whisper, a life's worth of experience packed into a few words. For a fleeting second, the young officer hesitated, the handcuffs cold and heavy in his hands. Something about her, the calmness, the dignity, the undeniable aura of wisdom, made him pause in a way he had never experienced before on the force. Around them, the shoppers watched in stunned silence. Phones still recorded, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as a routine enforcement action had turned into a moment of suspense, a story unfolding in real time that none of the witnesses could believe. A tiny, frail woman in handcuffs had the entire store holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn's presence, her quiet courage, and the sheer impossibility of what was happening captured everyone's attention. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She simply stood there, facing authority, embodying a strength that seemed to command respect even from a man whose job was to enforce the law. And in that brief moment, before anyone could react further, Officer Davis felt a shift within himself. Something deep, instinctual, and unexplainable made him reconsider what he thought he knew. For the first time, he questioned whether this arrest was truly about law and order, or whether it was about assumptions, quick judgments, and the blindness that comes from acting without understanding. The clink of the handcuffs, the whispers from the crowd, the tense stillness in the store, all of it coalesced into a moment that no one would ever forget. The shocking sight of a black grandmother, handcuffed and silent, staring down an officer in full uniform, had already imprinted itself into the minds of everyone present. And though the situation had not, the tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. Whispers spread like wildfire as shoppers tried to make sense of what had just happened. How could a grandmother, someone who looked like she should be baking cookies rather than being handcuffed, end up in this situation? The truth was far simpler than anyone imagined. It was a misunderstanding, but a misunderstanding that, for a moment, had the power to destroy Evelyn's dignity and reputation. Evelyn had arrived at the store that afternoon with the kind of routine practiced over decades. Her shopping list was neatly folded in her pocket, and her reusable tote bag hung over her shoulder. Her steps were slow but purposeful, the rhythm of someone who had walked through life with resilience and grace. She greeted the cashier warmly, exchanged a few polite words, and began carefully selecting her items. Little did she know, a chain of small events was about to escalate into a shocking public scene. Earlier in the day, the cashier had been distracted. A young man in line ahead of Evelyn was arguing loudly over a coupon, and the checkout line had become chaotic. Phones were ringing, carts were being unloaded at a rapid pace, and the cashier's attention was divided. In the flurry, Evelyn placed a small box of cookies into her tote bag, a natural, innocent movement as she organized her groceries before they could be scanned. But this small action, completely understandable under normal circumstances, was misinterpreted. Moments later, the store manager spotted Evelyn walking toward the exit. His eyes landed on the tote bag and the partially visible cookies. Panic and suspicion flared in his mind, and without taking the time to verify, he called the police. He insisted to Officer Davis that the elderly woman was attempting to steal. Evelyn tried to explain herself calmly, but her voice was drowned out by the urgency of the situation. For the officer, it looked like a clear-cut case. A suspicious item, a manager's claim, and a customer leaving the store. From Officer Davis's perspective, he was following procedure. He had been trained to act quickly in such situations. Yet, as he handcuffed Evelyn, something about her made him hesitate. Her calmness, the steadiness of her gaze, the quiet dignity in her posture. It didn't fit the pattern of someone who was attempting theft. But procedural duty demanded action, and he couldn't afford to ignore the manager's claim. Meanwhile, Evelyn's life experience was shining through. She wasn't panicking or resisting. She understood that reacting emotionally would only escalate the situation. She had faced prejudice and assumptions before, and she knew the importance of patience and composure. Her thoughts briefly wandered to her grandchildren waiting at home, to the embarrassment the situation could cause, and to frustration being misjudged. Yet she remained poised, letting the misunderstanding play out without confrontation. The shoppers around them began to pick up on the discrepancy. Some noticed that Evelyn had already been at the checkout earlier, likely paying for her items. Others remembered the chaos at the register and the distracted cashier. Slowly, murmurs started spreading. There must be some mistake. She didn't steal anything. Why is this happening? But these whispers were only background noise to Officer Davis, who still had his hands on the handcuffs. Complicating matters were the subtle biases and assumptions at play. Evelyn's age, race, and quiet demeanor may have influenced the rapid escalation. To the officer, it was a textbook scenario, but in reality, it was a harmless mistake misinterpreted by everyone involved. The danger of acting too quickly without understanding the full context had become painfully clear. The cashier, watching helplessly, felt a mix of guilt and fear. She knew the mistake had originated at her register, but the manager's insistence and the officer's presence made it difficult to intervene. Evelyn's calmness contrasted sharply with the anxiety and tension in the store. Even the manager's voice, once loud and authoritative, began to waver as he reviewed the situation and noticed confused expressions on other employees' faces. Inside Officer Davis, doubt started to creep in. Evelyn's behavior didn't match the profile of someone who would intentionally steal. She was polite, composed, and even empathetic, helping a child nearby who had dropped a bag without drawing attention to it. This tiny gesture, almost invisible to most, told him something important. Evelyn's actions were innocent, and perhaps he'd been too quick to judge. The store's atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Shoppers whispered and speculated, some recording the incident, others debating whether to intervene. The misunderstanding had escalated far beyond a simple error. It had become a public lesson in assumptions, judgments, and the consequences of acting before knowing the full story. Evelyn, with her quiet strength, had unwittingly become the center of this unfolding drama. Her presence alone commanded attention and respect, forcing those around her, including Officer Davis, to question their assumptions. Her dignity, calmness, and composure highlighted the stark contrast between the chaos of the accusation and the reality of the situation. By the time the officer led her toward the front of the store, it was clear that everyone present was witnessing more than a simple misunderstanding. They were watching a clash of perception versus reality, assumptions versus truth, and authority versus wisdom. Evelyn's innocence was evident in every gesture, every calm breath, and every unspoken word. The misunderstanding, though minor in its origin, had profound implications. It wasn't just about a box of cookies. It was about respect, judgment, and the ease with which a person's character can be misinterpreted. The store, the shoppers, the officer, and even the manager had all become part of a lesson in empathy and patience. And in the midst of it all, Evelyn remained the embodiment of quiet strength and dignity, reminding everyone that assumptions can be dangerous and that understanding requires pause and attention. And so, what started as a simple, everyday errand had spiraled into a dramatic moment, forcing all involved to confront their assumptions, biases, and the need for careful judgment. Evelyn's calm composure and quiet confidence set the stage for what would come next, a revelation so powerful it would leave. As Evelyn stood there, handcuffed in the center of the store, the air felt almost electric. Shoppers held their breath, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch in stunned silence. Phones were recording, whispers buzzed, and a sense of tension hung over every aisle. But amidst the chaos, Evelyn remained calm. She didn't fight. She didn't shout. She simply waited. And then, in a moment that would forever change the trajectory of the encounter, she leaned in slightly and whispered. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights and the murmurs of the crowd. "Son," she said, so quietly that only Officer Davis could hear, "do you know who I am?" The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The young officer, trained to assess threats and respond quickly, was completely unprepared for this. Her whisper carried a weight, a history, a life of experiences that seemed to pierce straight through procedural haze in which he operated. He looked at her, perplexed, confused, and instinctively a little uneasy. I'm sorry," he stammered, unsure whether he had heard correctly. But Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. There was something in her eyes, a sharp intelligence, a quiet authority, that made it impossible for him to dismiss her words as idle chatter. "I'm the woman who taught your mother how to be strong," she whispered again, her voice steady and calm. "I raised generations in this city, and I have lived my life with honesty and dignity. Look at me, officer. Do you see someone who would steal?" Her words, though soft, carried an undeniable power. The handcuffs suddenly felt heavier in Officer Davis's hands. The authority he wielded, the procedure he had followed without question, now collided with the stark reality staring him in the face. Evelyn was not just an elderly woman accused of theft. She was a pillar of her community, a mentor, and a grandmother who had spent decades shaping lives. And yet, in this brief moment, he had almost wrongfully punished her. Around them, the store seemed to fade into the background. The fluorescent lights, the hum of the cash registers, and the whispers of the crowd all became peripheral. The only thing that mattered was the quiet power of Evelyn's presence, the strength in her whisper, and the undeniable truth it conveyed. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't threatening. She was simply stating a fact that demanded acknowledgement. Officer Davis slowly began to lower his hands from the handcuffs, uncertainty creeping into his posture. He had been trained to act decisively, to trust the evidence presented to him by authority figures, and to follow procedure above all else. But Evelyn's words made him pause. For the first time, he realized that the human element, the wisdom, dignity, and history of a person, was something no training manual could teach. "Check the cameras," she continued, her whisper now slightly firmer. "You'll see the truth. You'll see that I paid for every item. You'll see that I did nothing wrong. You don't have to believe me, son. Just look at the evidence." Her calm command, paired with the unmistakable confidence in her eyes, forced Officer Davis to reconsider everything he thought he knew. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of a dawning awareness that he had almost made a monumental mistake. The quiet authority of an elderly woman, speaking softly, had made him question his own judgment, his assumptions, and his sense of duty. The shoppers, sensing the shift in the dynamic, watched intently. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the store. "Did you hear what she just said? She raised his mother? She's telling the truth." Some of them exchanged glances, realizing that the situation they had witnessed might not be what it seemed. The tension remained, but the balance of power had subtly shifted. Evelyn's whisper was more than just words. It was a revelation. It forced Officer Davis to confront his own biases, his reliance on procedure, and the dangers of acting too quickly without understanding context. He realized that he had almost punished someone not for what they had done, but for what someone else assumed they had done. The gravity of the situation hit him in full force. I need to see the footage, he muttered, almost to himself. The words felt heavy, weighted by the sudden realization of how close he had come to causing irreparable harm. Evelyn simply nodded, her expression calm but knowing. She didn't gloat. She didn't scold. She simply allowed him the space to correct his mistake. As the officer reviewed the footage on a nearby monitor, the truth became undeniable. Evelyn had picked up her groceries, placed them in her tote to organize them, and had paid for everything. The security cameras even captured her assisting a small child who had dropped a bag, an act of kindness that contrasted sharply with the accusations she had just faced. Officer Davis felt his face go pale, the color draining as the realization sank in. He had almost handcuffed someone innocent, someone who had spent her life embodying the very principles he had sworn to uphold. Evelyn's whisper had done more than clear her name. It had delivered a powerful lesson in humility, patience, and respect. In that single moment, she had reminded everyone present, and especially Officer Davis, that human dignity and wisdom cannot be measured by appearances, age, or circumstance. Sometimes, it only takes a soft-spoken truth to shatter assumptions and open eyes. The store remained silent for a few moments, the tension finally easing as reality set in. Shoppers who had been ready to record a crime now recorded a lesson. Phones captured the expressions of disbelief, relief, and admiration for the woman who had stood her ground without raising her voice. The power of her whisper resonated far beyond the handcuffs, far beyond the aisle, and into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. Evelyn, still calm and composed, finally straightened her back. She had done what she came to do. She had spoken her truth. Officer Davis, meanwhile, struggled to regain his composure. He had acted based on procedure, yet he had been corrected not by authority, but by life experience, wisdom, and a whisper that carried more weight than any reprimand or lecture ever could. By the time Evelyn was freed from the handcuffs, the store had become a different place. The incident had transformed from a potential injustice into a moment of reflection, learning, and awe. Evelyn's quiet authority, expressed through a single whisper, had changed the course of the day and left a lasting impression on everyone who had been present. In that moment, the lesson was clear. As Evelyn's whisper echoed in Officer Davis's mind, the room seemed to hold its breath. The clinking of handcuffs, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, and the faint murmur of shoppers were suddenly background noise to the moment of reckoning unfolding before him. He knew that simply taking her word for it wasn't enough. He had a duty to verify the facts. And so, the investigation began. "Ma'am, I need to check the security footage," Officer Davis said, his voice steady but slightly shaky. Evelyn simply nodded, her posture calm, her hands relaxed despite the earlier tension. Her eyes, wise and unyielding, seemed to convey patience. She had seen mistakes made by others before, and she understood that justice sometimes required careful attention. Officer Davis walked briskly to the security office, tried to keep his mind focused despite the swirling guilt he felt. The crowd of shoppers remained nearby, watching silently, whispering to one another, their phones recording the entire process. Some murmured apologies, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as a public confrontation was now becoming a lesson in humility and perspective. He accessed the video feed and replayed the moments leading up to the arrest. Evelyn entered the store calmly, greeting the cashier with a polite smile. She carefully selected her groceries, placing items into her tote bag to organize them before checkout. At that moment, the cookies, the item that caused all the confusion, were gently placed inside. Far from being an act of theft, it was a simple, practical action by a woman who had shopped this way for years. The footage revealed a crucial detail. Evelyn had approached the register and paid for each item with precision, handing over exact change to the box of cookies that had sparked the misunderstanding. Every motion was deliberate, honest, and careful. Officer Davis felt his chest tighten. He had nearly punished an innocent woman over a split-second misinterpretation. The realization weighed heavily on him. But there was more. As he continued watching, another layer of Evelyn's character emerged. Earlier in the aisle, she had noticed a small child drop a bag. Without hesitation, she bent down, picked up the fallen items, and handed them back with a gentle smile. The act, small and unnoticed by most in real time, now spoke volumes on the screen. Evelyn's integrity and compassion weren't limited to her own life. They extended to everyone around her. She was a person whose actions consistently reflected honesty, empathy, and moral clarity. Officer Davis called the store manager over to review the footage. The manager, confident and assertive earlier, now leaned in uncomfortably as he watched Evelyn's actions unfold on screen. His initial assumptions began to crumble. The video evidence was undeniable. Evelyn had done nothing wrong. The cookies had been paid for. The tote bag had been a tool for organization, not concealment. Even the act of helping the child underscored her character. For the first time, Officer Davis felt the full weight of the mistake he had almost made. The handcuffs, once a symbol of authority, now felt heavy in his hands. He had followed procedure, yes, but procedure without context had nearly led to injustice. His pulse raced as he replayed the footage multiple times, absorbing the undeniable truth. The soft whisper from Evelyn had been right. All he needed was to look closer, observe fully, and trust the evidence instead of assumptions. The investigation also revealed another subtle detail. Evelyn's notebook, tucked safely in her tote, contained lists for neighborhood volunteer projects, community contacts, and notes on helping her local church organize events. This wasn't merely a law-abiding citizen. This was a woman devoted to improving the lives of those around her, silently working for decades to create a better community. Officer Davis realized that he hadn't just almost accused an innocent woman. He had almost undermined a life of service, a legacy built on kindness, honesty, and integrity. Meanwhile, the shoppers in the store sensed a shift in authority. Their whispers grew louder, moving from concern for Evelyn to reflection on the assumptions that had fueled the misunderstanding. She paid for everything. He didn't even check first. I can't believe this happened. Evelyn's quiet strength and the unfolding truth had turned a scene of potential injustice into a powerful lesson for all who witnessed it. Finally, Officer Davis stepped back and exhaled deeply. He approached Evelyn, who had remained calm and composed the entire time. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I acted too quickly. I should have looked more carefully before making assumptions. I see now that you did nothing wrong." Evelyn smiled gently, her calmness unbroken. She didn't lecture him. She didn't scold. Her dignity and quiet authority had already delivered a message more effectively than any words could. She allowed him to absorb the lesson, to confront his error, and understand the true weight of responsibility that comes with authority. The store manager, too, stepped forward, visibly humbled. He offered an apology, acknowledging that his assumptions had led to a needless escalation. Officer Davis, too, recognized the importance of humility, patience, and empathy. What began as a procedural investigation had become a profound lesson in human judgment, perception, and respect. By the end of the investigation, Evelyn had been fully cleared. The handcuffs were removed and her dignity restored. The crowd, once tense and uncertain, now erupted in subtle murmurs of admiration. Phones continued recording, not a crime in progress, but a lesson in patience, compassion, and the power of looking beyond appearances. Evelyn gathered her groceries with deliberate care, her calmness unwavering. She had faced what could have been an embarrassing and demeaning situation and transformed it into a teaching moment for everyone present. Officer Davis watched her, the weight of guilt and the depth of respect reflected in his eyes. He had learned something far more valuable than any procedural guideline, that human dignity, observation, and empathy must always guide action, even under pressure. The investigation concluded not just with the truth revealed, but with a collective awareness that assumptions could be dangerous. Authority must be tempered with understanding, and one quiet, dignified person can change the course of events with truth and composure. Evelyn had not just been vindicated. She had educated everyone around her on the profound importance of patience, observation, and justice tempered with humanity. By the time the store returned to its routine rhythm, the impact of the investigation lingered. Shoppers reflected on how quickly someone could be misjudged, and how critical it is to pause, observe, and understand before acting. Evelyn, having weathered the ordeal with unwavering grace, had left them. By the time Evelyn stepped out of the store, the tension that had gripped the aisles all afternoon had finally begun to dissipate. But the echoes of the incident, the handcuffs, the whispers, the almost mistaken accusation, lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. What began as a simple misunderstanding over a box of cookies had evolved into a profound lesson, one that would resonate far beyond the fluorescent lights and crowded checkout lanes. For Officer Davis, the lessons were immediate and deeply personal. He had spent years training to respond quickly, to trust procedure, and to enforce rules without hesitation. He prided himself on his decisiveness and his ability to act under pressure. Yet, in that one moment, Evelyn's calm dignity had revealed the limitations of procedure when divorced from empathy. He realized that the law is not just about rules. It is about people, about judgment, and about understanding the human stories behind every decision. Her whisper, soft, deliberate, and full of quiet authority, had been a wake-up call. "Do you know who I am?" she had asked. That simple question carried more weight than any argument or evidence could. It reminded him that authority is not absolute, and that assumptions, no matter how convenient, can be dangerously misleading. Officer Davis understood that a moment of reflection, a pause to truly see and listen, can prevent mistakes that might otherwise have lasting consequences. The store manager learned a similar, humbling lesson. His initial reaction had been rooted in fear of loss and the desire to maintain control. He had seen a tote bag, an elderly woman, and a partially visible item, and immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. Watching the security footage and seeing Evelyn's actions laid bare, he had no choice but to confront his error. The lesson was clear. Assumptions based on appearances are fragile, unreliable, and potentially harmful. True judgment requires evidence, patience, and a willingness to question one's own instincts. Shoppers, too, were not immune to reflection. What had initially seemed like an ordinary grocery trip had turned into a public demonstration of integrity and wisdom. Witnessing Evelyn's composure, the video evidence, and the officer's realization prompted a collective reconsideration of assumptions. Many muttered quietly among themselves, acknowledging how easily one can misjudge another based on age, race, or demeanor. In a society where judgments are often quick and reactions even quicker, Evelyn's example became a reminder that pause and understanding are invaluable. Evelyn herself offered the most important lesson of all, though she did so without speaking aloud. Her calmness, patience, and grace demonstrated that dignity is maintained not through confrontation, but through composure and the quiet strength of truth. By allowing the investigation to unfold, by trusting that evidence and honesty would prevail, she showed that true authority comes not from fear or force, but from integrity and character. Reflecting on the day, one could see multiple layers of learning. First, there was a practical lesson about assumptions. A small misunderstanding can escalate rapidly if people act too quickly, relying on appearances rather than facts. Second, there was a moral lesson. Empathy, patience, and humanity are just as critical as rules and procedures when dealing with others. Third, there was a social lesson. Communities are strengthened when people pause to understand each other, instead of judging hastily or blindly trusting initial impressions. For Officer Davis, this lesson became personal. As he escorted Evelyn back to her groceries, he realized that his career, his sense of duty, and his pride in following the law needed to be balanced with humility. He had almost failed in that balance. But Evelyn's example reminded him that policing is as much about understanding and respect as it is about rules. He vowed, silently, that he would carry this lesson forward, ensuring that future actions were guided by both procedure and empathy. The store manager, too, emerged changed. He apologized not just to Evelyn, but to his staff and the shoppers who had witnessed the ordeal. His voice carried the weight of humility, and his acknowledgement of error became a public lesson in accountability. Mistakes, he realized, are inevitable, but how one responds to them can either compound harm or restore trust. And for the community, the shoppers, employees, and bystanders, the lesson was both immediate and enduring. It was about justice, yes, but also about perspective, patience, and human decency. Witnessing Evelyn's dignity, her calm authority, and the slow but undeniable revelation of truth reminded them that every person has a story, and every action has context. In an age where judgments are often rapid and permanent, taking a moment to see the full picture can be transformative. Evelyn herself reflected quietly as she gathered her groceries and left the store. She had weathered an ordeal that could have left her embarrassed, humiliated, or angry. Instead, she had transformed it into an educational moment, demonstrating that strength is not loud, that authority does not require aggression, and that truth, combined with patience, always is power. Her life experience, wisdom, and composure became a lesson not just for Officer Davis or the manager, but for anyone who witnessed the incident directly or through social media sharing later. Ultimately, the incident underscored a timeless truth. Assumptions can mislead, authority can err, and humanity must guide judgment. In a single afternoon, Evelyn had shown that quiet integrity and steadfast composure could correct errors, teach lessons, and restore justice. The handcuffs, once a symbol of authority, had become a symbol of misjudgment, and Evelyn's whisper, the catalyst for reflection, had restored balance. The store, returning to its usual rhythm, was forever changed. Employees and shoppers carried the lesson forward, speaking quietly about the day a grandmother had turned a tense situation into a powerful demonstration of truth and dignity. Officer Davis left with a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of the lesson etched into his mind. The manager, humbled and wiser, understood that patience and verification are always better than assumption. And Evelyn, she walked home with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her integrity, calm composure, and moral authority had made a lasting impact. In the end, the lesson was clear. A single act of honesty and courage, expressed calmly and confidently, can teach lessons that resonate far beyond the moment. Human dignity, patience, and empathy are invaluable, and sometimes it takes a quiet, determined voice to remind the world of these truths. Evelyn had done exactly that, leaving a legacy of wisdom and a lesson that would not soon be forgotten. By the time Evelyn finally stepped out of the store, the handcuffs removed and her dignity restored, the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as an ordinary shopping trip had evolved into an unforgettable lesson about humanity, judgment, and integrity. Shoppers, employees, and even Officer Davis found themselves quietly reflecting on everything that had happened. The assumptions, the tension, and the ultimate revelation of truth. Evelyn gathered her groceries slowly, placing each item carefully in her tote bag. She moved with calm, deliberate grace, a stark contrast to the chaos that had surrounded her earlier. Around her, the whispers of the crowd were no longer critical or judgmental. They were filled with admiration. Some murmured apologies. Others shook their heads in disbelief at how quickly they, too, had assumed the worst. Phones that had been recording in anticipation of scandal were now capturing a different story entirely, a story of patience, dignity, and quiet heroism. Officer Davis remained near the monitor, his hands finally unclenched. He felt a mixture of relief, guilt, and deep respect. He had been trained to follow procedure, to act decisively, and to trust authority. But this incident had taught him that rules alone are never enough. Judgment requires empathy, patience, and the willingness to see the full story before acting. Evelyn's calm whisper had forced him to confront his own biases, assumptions, and the danger of acting too quickly. The weight of almost making a grave mistake settled heavily on his shoulders. He approached Evelyn cautiously, not as an officer imposing authority, but as someone seeking to make amends. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quieter than before, "I want to apologize not just for what happened, but for how quickly I acted without understanding the situation. You didn't deserve any of this." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with both understanding and quiet strength. She didn't need to scold him. The experience itself had already conveyed the lesson. Her composure, dignity, and moral authority had made the apology unnecessary in words, but essential in recognition. By simply standing firm in truth, she had reminded Officer Davison and everyone present of the power of patience, integrity, and quiet courage. The store manager, too, approached, humbled and visibly remorseful. I should have trusted the evidence first, not my assumptions, he admitted. I let fear and haste dictate my actions. I'm truly sorry for putting you through this, ma'am. Evelyn nodded gently, allowing the acknowledgement of wrongdoing to pass without bitterness. Her life had taught her that anger often solves nothing. Understanding, patience, and dignity create change. Outside the store, shoppers lingered, discussing what they had witnessed. Many expressed shock that a misunderstanding could escalate so quickly, yet gratitude that it had been resolved peacefully. Some reflected on their own assumptions and judgments, recognizing that this incident was a reminder how easily people could misjudge others based on appearance, age, or race. Evelyn, without uttering a word to them directly, had provided a lesson far more powerful than any lecture could have delivered. For Officer Davis, the reflection was particularly intense. He replayed the day's events in his mind. The initial alarm, the handcuffing, Evelyn's quiet strength, the evidence on the footage, and finally, her whisper that had stopped him from making a mistake he might never have forgiven himself for. He realized that the law, though vital, could never replace human judgment and empathy. One moment of patience, one careful observation, could prevent a lifetime of regret. Evelyn had reminded him of this in the most unforgettable way. Evelyn herself reflected quietly as she walked home, her tote bag full, but her spirit even fuller. She had faced public scrutiny, a false accusation, and the intimidating presence of authority, yet she had handled it with grace and composure. She understood that her actions had taught lessons far beyond the immediate situation. By maintaining dignity and relying on truth, she had set an example that others would remember far longer than the incident itself. As she moved through the streets, she noticed small acts of kindness and human connection that she had overlooked before. Smiles exchanged between strangers, a parent helping a child across the street, a neighbor holding a door open. All these small gestures reflected the lessons she had embodied: patience, empathy, and the quiet power of integrity. The incident in the store had amplified her awareness, reminding her that every interaction carries weight and that dignity and calm authority can transform even the most tense situations. Back at the store, Officer Davis and the manager convened to review their protocols. They recognized that while procedures are important, human judgment cannot be ignored. They vowed to implement more training on empathy, patience, and context awareness, ensuring that no one else would face a similar misjudgment. Evelyn had not only vindicated herself, but had indirectly improved the system to protect others in the future. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the local community. People shared it on social media, not as a scandal, but as a powerful lesson in patience, dignity, and moral authority. Evelyn's calm, quiet courage became an example for many, a reminder that truth, composure, and empathy can prevent injustice, heal misunderstanding, and inspire respect. The video clips captured not just an incident, but a teaching moment, a moment that encouraged viewers everywhere to pause before judging, to observe carefully, and to act with empathy. The resolution of the incident also brought a subtle, personal transformation. Officer Davis carried a new perspective into his work. The manager approached interactions with more care and attention. Shoppers reflected on their own assumptions. And Evelyn, she continued her life quietly, with the knowledge that she had turned a tense situation into a lesson that would ripple far beyond that store. Her integrity had restored balance. Her calmness had diffused tension, and her life had become a silent but powerful teacher for everyone who had witnessed the unfolding truth. In the end, the resolution of the incident was more than just a correction of a misunderstanding. It was a celebration of human dignity, the quiet strength of character, and the power of patience and empathy. Evelyn's story served as a reminder that even in moments of fear, confusion, or accusation, truth and composure prevail. Her whisper, the small, decisive act that shifted the course of events, became a symbol of moral authority, a lesson in humility, and a lasting testament to the impact one individual can have on a community. As the sun set and the city returned to its rhythm, the lesson lingered. Assumptions can mislead, authority can err, but integrity, patience, and quiet courage can restore balance and teach the world a lesson that echoes far longer than any moment of fear or misjudgment.